Sir Thomas More, venerated by Catholics as Saint Thomas More, was an English lawyer, social philosopher, author, statesman and noted Renaissance humanist. He was also a counsellor to Henry VIII, and Lord High Chancellor of England from October 1529 to the 16th of May 1532. More opposed the Protestant Reformation, in particular the theology of Martin Luther and William Tyndale. He also wrote Utopia, published in 1516, about the political system of an imaginary ideal island nation. More opposed the king's separation from the Catholic Church, refusing to acknowledge Henry as supreme head of the Church of England and the annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. After refusing to take the oath of supremacy, he was convicted of treason and beheaded. Pope Pius XI canonized More in 1935 as a martyr. Pope John Paul II in 2000 declared him the heavenly patron of statesmen and politicians. Since 1980, the Church of England has remembered More liturgically as a Reformation martyr. The Soviet Union honored him for the communistic attitude toward property rights he expressed in Utopia. Early life. Born in Milk Street in London, on 7 February 1478, Thomas More was the son of Sir John More, a successful lawyer and later judge, and his wife Agnes. More was educated at St Antony's School, then considered one of London's finest schools. From 1490 to 1492, More served John Morton, the Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Chancellor of England, as a household page. Morton enthusiastically supported the new learning, and thought highly of the young More. Believing that More had great potential, Morton nominated him for a place at Oxford University. More began his studies at Oxford in 1492, and received a classical education. Studying under Thomas Linacre and William Grocyn, he became proficient in both Latin and Greek. More left Oxford after only 2 years, at his father's insistence, to begin legal training in London at New Inn, one of the Inns of Chancery. In 1496, More became a student at Lincoln's Inn, one of the Inns of Court, where he remained until 1502, when he was called to the bar. Spiritual life. According to his friend, theologian Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam, More once seriously contemplated abandoning his legal career to become a monk. Between 1503 and 1504, More lived near the Carthusian monastery outside the walls of London and joined in the monks' spiritual exercises. Although he deeply admired their piety, More ultimately decided to remain a layman, standing for election to Parliament in 1504 and marrying the following year. In spite of his choice to pursue a secular career, More continued ascetical practices for the rest of his life, such as wearing a hair shirt next to his skin and occasionally engaging in flagellation. A tradition of the Third Order of St. Francis honors More as a member of that order on their calendar of saints. Family life. More married Jane Colt in 1505. She was 5 years, 1 month younger than her husband, quiet and good-natured. Erasmus reported that More wanted to give his young wife a better education than she had previously received at home, and tutored her in music and literature. The couple had 4 children before Jane died in 1511. Margaret, Elizabeth, Cicely, and John. Going against friends' advice and common custom, within 30 days More had married one of the many eligible women among his wide circle of friends. He chose a rich widow, Alice Harper Middleton. The speed of the marriage was so unusual that More had to get a dispensation of the banns, which, due to his good public reputation, he easily obtained. Alice More lacks Jane's docility. More's friend Andrew Monius derided Alice as a hook-nosed harpy. Erasmus, however, called their marriage happy. More had no children from his second marriage, although he raised Alice's daughter from her previous marriage as his own. More also became the guardian of a young girl named Anne Cressaker, who would eventually marry his son, John More. An affectionate father, More wrote letters to his children whenever he was away on legal or government business. and encouraged them to write to him often. More insisted upon giving his daughters the same classical education as his sons, a highly unusual attitude at the time. His eldest daughter, Margaret, attracted much admiration for her erudition, especially her fluency in Greek and Latin. More told his daughter of his pride in her academic accomplishment in September 1522, after he showed the bishop a letter she had written. When he saw from the signature that it was the letter of a lady, his surprise led him to read it more eagerly. He said he would never have believed it to be your work unless I had assured him of the fact, and he began to praise it in the highest terms, for its pure Latinity, its correctness, its erudition, and its expressions of tender affection. He took out at once from his pocket a Portuguese gold coin, to send to you as a pledge in token of his goodwill towards you. More's decision to educate his daughters set an example for other noble families. Even Erasmus became much more favorable once he witnessed their accomplishments. A portrait of More and his family was painted by Holbein, but it was lost in a fire in the 18th century. More's grandson commissioned a copy, 2 versions of which survive. Early political career. In 1504 More was elected to Parliament to represent Great Yarmouth, and in 1510 began representing London. From 1510, More served as one of the 2 under-sheriffs of the City of London, a position of considerable responsibility in which he earned a reputation as an honest and effective public servant. More became Master of Request in 1514, the same year in which he was appointed as a Privy Councillor, after undertaking a diplomatic mission to the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, accompanying Thomas Wolsey, Cardinal Archbishop of York, to Calais and Bruges. More was knighted and made Under-Treasurer of the Exchequer in 1521. As secretary and personal advisor to King Henry VIII, More became increasingly influential, welcoming foreign diplomats, drafting official documents, and serving as a liaison between the king and Lord Chancellor Wolsey. More later served as High Steward for the Universities of Oxford and Cambridge. In 1523 More was elected as Knight of the Shire for Middlesexon. On Wolsey's recommendation, the House of Commons elected More its Speaker. In 1525 More became Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, with executive and judicial responsibilities over much of northern England. Chancellorship. After Wolsey fell, More succeeded to the office of Chancellor in 1529. He dispatched cases with unprecedented rapidity. Campaign against the Reformation. More supported the Catholic Church and saw the Protestant Reformation as heresy, a threat to the unity of both church and society. Believing in the theology, polemics, and ecclesiastical laws of the Church, More heard Luther's call to destroy the Catholic Church as a call to war. His early actions against the Reformation included aiding Wolsey in preventing Lutheran books from being imported into England, spying on and investigating suspected Protestants, especially publishers, and arresting anyone holding in his possession, transporting, or selling the books of the Protestant Reformation. More vigorously suppressed the traveling country ministers who used Tyndale's English translation of the New Testament. It contained controversial translations of certain words. For example, Tyndale used senior and elder rather than priest for the Greek presbyteros, and some of the marginal glosses challenged Catholic doctrine. It was during this time that most of his literary polemics appeared. Rumors circulated during and after More's lifetime regarding ill treatment of heretics during his time as Lord Chancellor. The popular anti-Catholic polemicist John Fox, who placed Protestant sufferings against the background of the Antichrist, was instrumental in publicizing accusations of torture in his famous Book of Martyrs, claiming that More had often personally used violence or torture while interrogating heretics. Later authors, such as Brian Monahan and Michael Farris, cite Fox when repeating these allegations. More himself denied these allegations. Stories of a similar nature were current even in More's lifetime, and he denied them forcefully. He admitted that he did imprison heretics in his house, their Schorkepenge, he called it, but he utterly rejected claims of torture and whipping. So help me God. However, in More's Apology, published in 1533, he writes that he only applied corporal punishment to 2 heretics: a child who was caned in front of his family for heresy regarding the Eucharist, and a feeble-minded man who was whipped for disrupting prayers. During More's chancellorship, 6 people were burned at the stake for heresy. They were Thomas Hitton, Thomas Bilney, Richard Bayfield, John Tewkesbury, Thomas Dusgate, and James Bainham. Monaghan has argued that More was influential in the burning of Tyndale, as More's agents had long pursued him, even though this took place over a year after his own death. Burning at the stake had long been a standard punishment for heresy. About 30 burnings had taken place in the century before More's elevation to Chancellor, and burning continued to be used by both Catholics and Protestants during the religious upheaval of the following decades. Ackroyd notes that More explicitly approved of burning. After the case of John Tewkesbury, a London leather seller found guilty by the Bishop of London, John Stokesley, of harbouring banned books and sentenced to burning for refusing to recant, More declared. He burned as there was neue Recherei when a better worthy. Modern commentators are divided over More's religious actions as Chancellor, while biographers such as Peter Ackroyd, a Catholic English biographer, have taken a relatively tolerant view of More's campaign against Protestantism by placing his actions within the turbulent religious climate of the time. Other eminent historians, such as Richard Marius, an American scholar of the Reformation, have been more critical, believing that persecutions, including More's zealous and well-documented advocacy of extermination for Protestants, were a betrayal of More's earlier humanist convictions. Some Protestants take a different view. In 1980, despite being a fierce opponent of the English Reformation that created the Church of England, More was added to the Church of England's calendar of saints and heroes of the Christian Church, jointly with John Fisher, to be commemorated every 6th of July as Thomas More, scholar, and John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, Reformation Martyrs, 1535. When honouring him by making him patron saint of statesmen and politicians in October 2000, Pope John Paul II stated, "It can be said that he demonstrated in a singular way the value of a moral conscience, even if, in his actions against heretics, he reflected the limits of the culture of his time." Resignation. As the conflict over supremacy between the papacy and the king reached its apogee, More continued to remain steadfast in supporting the supremacy of the Pope as successor of Peter over that of the King of England. In 1530, More refused to sign a letter by the leading English churchmen and aristocrats asking Pope Clement VII to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and also quarrelled with Henry VIII over the heresy laws. In 1531, Henry had isolated More by purging most clergy who supported the papal stance from senior positions in the Church. Parliament's reinstatement of the charge of praemunire in 1529 had made it a crime to support in public or office the claim of any authority outside the realm to have a legal jurisdiction superior to the king's. In 1531, a royal decree required the clergy to take an oath acknowledging the king as supreme head of the church in England. As a layperson, More did not need to take the oath, and the clergy, after some initial resistance, took the oath with the addition of the clause, "as far as the law of Christ allows." However, More saw he could not render the support Henry expected from his Lord Chancellor for the policy the king was developing to support the annulment of his marriage with Catherine. In 1532 he petitioned the king to relieve him of his office, alleging failing health. Henry granted his request. Trial and execution. In 1533, More refused to attend the coronation of Anne Boleyn as the Queen of England. Technically, this was not an act of treason, as More had written to Henry acknowledging Anne's queenship and expressing his desire for the king's happiness and the new queen's health. Despite this, his refusal to attend was widely interpreted as a snub against Anne, and Henry took action against him. Shortly thereafter, More was charged with accepting bribes, but the charges had to be dismissed for lack of any evidence. In early 1534, More was accused of conspiring with the Holy Maid of Kent, Elizabeth Barton, a nun who had prophesied against the king's annulment. But More was able to produce a letter in which he had instructed Barton not to interfere with state matters. On 13 April 1534, More was asked to appear before a commission and swear his allegiance to the Parliamentary Act of Succession. More accepted Parliament's right to declare Anne Boleyn the legitimate Queen of England, but he steadfastly refused to take the oath of supremacy of the Crown in the relationship between the kingdom and the Church in England, holding fast to the teaching of papal supremacy. More refused to take the oath and furthermore publicly refused to uphold Henry's annulment from Catherine. John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, refused the oath along with More. The oath reads, "By reason whereof the Bishop of Rome and See Apostolic, contrary to the great and inviolable grants or jurisdictions given by God immediately to emperors, kings and princes in succession to their heirs, hath presumed in times past to invest who should please them to inherit in other men's kingdoms and dominions, which thing we your most humble subjects, both spiritual and temporal, do most abhor and detest." With his refusal to support the king's annulment, More's enemies had enough evidence to have the king arrest him on treason. 4 days later, Henry had More imprisoned in the Tower of London. There More prepared a devotional dialogue of comfort against tribulation. While More was imprisoned in the Tower, Thomas Cromwell made several visits, urging More to take the oath, which More continued to refuse. On 1 July 1535, More was tried before a panel of judges that included the new Lord Chancellor, Sir Thomas Audley, as well as Anne Boleyn's father, brother, and uncle. He was charged with high treason for denying the validity of the Act of Supremacy and was tried under the following section of the Treason Act 1534. If any person or persons, after the 1st day of February next coming, do maliciously wish, will or desire, by words or writing, or by craft imagine, invent, practice, or attempt any bodily harm to be done or committed to the king's most royal person, the queen's, or their heirs apparent, or to deprive them or any of them of their dignity, title, or name of their royal estates, that then every such person and persons so offending, shall have and suffer such pains of death and other penalties, as is limited and accustomed in cases of high treason. More, relying on legal precedent and the maxim, qui tacit consentiae videtur, silent is seen to consent, understood that he could not be convicted as long as he did not explicitly deny that the king was supreme head of the church, and he therefore refused to answer all questions regarding his opinions on the subject. Thomas Cromwell, at the time the most powerful of the king's advisers, brought forth the Solicitor General, Richard Rich, to testify that More had, in his presence, denied that the king was the legitimate head of the church. This testimony was characterized by More as being extremely dubious. Witnesses Richard Southwell and Mr. Palmer both denied having heard the details of the reported conversation, and as More himself pointed out, "Can it therefore seem likely to your lordships, that I should in so weighty an affair as this, act so unadvisedly, as to trust Mr. Rich, a man I had always so mean an opinion of, in reference to his truth and honesty, that I should only impart to Mr. Rich the secrets of my conscience in respect to the king's supremacy, the particular secrets, and only point about which I have been so long pressed to explain myself, which I never did, nor never would reveal, when the act was once made, either to the king himself, or any of his privy councillors, as is well known to your honours, who have been sent upon no other account at several times by his majesty to me in the Tower. I refer it to your judgments, my lords, whether this can seem credible to any of your lordships." The jury took only 15 minutes, however, to find More guilty. After the jury's verdict was delivered and before his sentencing, More spoke freely of his belief that no temporal man may be the head of the spirituality. He was sentenced to be hanged, drawn and quartered, but the king commuted this to execution by decapitation. The execution took place on the 6th of July 1535. When he came to mount the steps to the scaffold, he is widely quoted as saying, I pray you, Mr. Lieutenant, see me safe up and for my coming down, I can shift for myself." While on the scaffold he declared that he died, the king's good servant, but God's first. Relics. Another comment he is believed to have made to the executioner is that his beard was completely innocent of any crime, and did not deserve the axe. He then positioned his beard so that it would not be harmed. More asked that his foster-adopted daughter Margaret Clement be given his headless corpse to bury. He was buried at the Tower of London, in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula in an unmarked grave. His head was fixed upon a pike over London Bridge for a month, according to the normal custom for traitors. His daughter Margaret Roper rescued it, possibly by bribery, before it could be thrown in the River Thames. The skull is believed to rest in the Roper vault of St. Dunstan's Church, Canterbury, though some researchers have claimed it might be within the tomb he erected for More in Chelsea Old Church. The evidence, however, seems to be in favour of its placement in St. Dunstan's, with the remains of his daughter, Margaret Roper, and her husband's family, whose vault it was. Among other surviving relics is his hair shirt, presented for safekeeping by Margaret Clement, his adopted daughter. This was long in the custody of the community of Augustinian canonesses who until 1983 lived at the convent at Abbot Skerswell Priory, Devon. It is now preserved at Sion Abbey, near South Brent.